All right, if I can have everyone's attention, I think I have a quorum. I want to call the meeting to order. If you would, I'm going to have to do this first. Mine just went off. If everybody please shut their cell phones off. I just had mine on. And if you would, please join me in a word of prayer, please, before we start. Most gracious Heavenly Father, once again, we come to you asking for your guidance and your cares. We meet and deliberate and talk about this very important piece of legislation that we have before the committee today. Please, dear God, as we always ask you, give us cool minds and warm hearts and the wisdom that we need to make the right decisions for only one reason, and that's the boys and girls of this state. Lead and guide and direct us now, for we always ask these things in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. I want to welcome you here today to the Education Committee meeting. And I know we have some visitors here today that have never been here before. So if you've never been here before, this is your first meeting. Stand up and let us see who you are, where we can welcome you. You've never been to an education meeting. I know Paige has a lot of teachers here. I want to see my teachers. Stand up. Let's let the teachers all stand. And let's give our teachers a big round of applause. We're glad to have you here. Yeah. We're glad you're here today with us. The purpose of the meeting today, where everyone will know, where there's no misunderstanding, we have a substitute to House Bill 797, enabling legislation, that we're going to have presented. We're going to have the piece of legislation presented today, and we do have some copies. Others can get copies if they need them, and we'll get them to you. But we're not going to have a lot of questions, not have testimony. That will come at a later date. We're not going to take a vote today because I think it's important to look at it, to see what it is, and then have some time to discuss it. Representative Speaker Pro Tem Jones over here has told me, and she said, tell everyone that my office is going to be open. We got plenty of time to discuss this. So look at it, get it, and discuss it. We're going to have her present it today. I will allow the members of the committees to ask a couple of questions, but no testimony. Then you will have time, though. I will give you time at another time to do this. So without any further delay, I'd like to ask our Speaker Pro Tem to come forward and present substitute House Bill 797. We're working from LC 334638S. Does everyone on the committee have a copy? All right, Representative Jones, thank you. Let's see, where do you turn that on up? The 90? Okay.
Especially after our healthy discussions in the past on similar legislation. This would be accompanying legislation to help provide a framework to the state on how to authorize and fund state charter schools. In the beginning, this is the second substitute, so to make sure you have the right LC, it's LC 334638S. A number of you were here in 2008 when we passed 881, and so I'll try to point out some of the changes from 4 years ago to now, just to sort of kind of show the evolution of where I think we're heading with charter schools authorized by the state. If you look at the findings in the beginning, I changed the findings completely to reflect more the direction that we're going with your help. I didn't bring 881 with me, but I think we had the findings perhaps in the first substitute, and these are quite different. You'll see the words that state charter schools can serve as a complement to the educational opportunities provided by local boards of education, that state charter schools do not supplant public schools, and that it's the intent of the General Assembly that there established a state-level commission under the authority of the State Board of Education to develop and support state charter schools. Lines 28 through 38 are definitions, some existing in law, some that we added to make it clear. You know, for example, number 4, state charter school, that it's referring to a state charter school as in the constitutional amendment. When you get to section 20-2-2082, this is relatively similar to what we saw in 881 and actually worked quite well with the commission under the direction of the State Board of Education. They are appointed by the State Board of Education with recommendations coming from 2 statewide elected officers, the Lieutenant Governor, and 2 appointees from recommendations made by the Speaker of House, who we elect in the Georgia House. The only change of significance that I made here is I increased the authority of the State Board relative to 881. It took a 2/3 majority for the State Board to overturn. Now it would just be a simple majority, more in keeping with this being under the authority of the State Board of Education. Section 20-2-83 is very similar to the previous legislation, in which it says what this commission would do and how they would report. Some of this may still need some revision. I do look at this as a rough draft, as a beginning point. The 20-2-2084 has funding, which of course is very different from 881. In 881, there was a tether to the local school boards in which a deduction was made of state funds. Of course, as we know on the committee, local funds were never utilized. That's expressly prohibited in the Constitution. But state funds were reduced by a similar amount that reflected what the sum of state funds and local funds would have been. This changes that completely. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. This has to do with the authorizing, 20-2-2084. There would be two methods. And
Representative, I'll take your questions after she finishes. Let her finish, then we'll take questions.
I did hear there were some concerns expressed on two fronts. One, I don't think we saw much of this with the commission, but there was a concern with the word cherry picking, that you could go into a school system or into an area and set an attendance zone to preferentially attract certain students. I don't think the evidence that I've seen is we haven't really seen this anymore with state authorized and with local authorized. But I think it's a reasonable concern, and I certainly don't want that. So the first way that one could be authorized is one would simply have to have a statewide attendance zone. And so that the effects would be of where the students would come from would be regional in nature. So, for example, if Georgia State wanted to co-sponsor with a charter school or a technical school that had a broad region of folks that would drive there or might utilize that, when you had the lottery, that anyone in the state that fit those grades could apply to, and when I say apply, they could put their name in to the lottery. But if you drop down to line 146, you would still, as with 881, you would have to submit the application to the local school board where it's physically located, because they need to know that, and it gives them notice so that they also, as you'll see later on the bill, and as with 881, they could convey, as others could as well, but they could let the commission know as well of whatever support, concerns, or suggestions that they had. The second is if you want to have a defined attendance zone, which previously were all of the 881. I mean, with the exception of, I think, 2 virtual schools, they had a defined attendance zone. And then you would have to you'd have to submit an application to or a charter application to all the school systems that were within or affected by that attendance zone, and you would have to get a denial first from the one in which the bricks and mortar were physically located before you would be able to go forward to the Charter Commission. I want to actually qualify that. You would give them 60 days to either take action or deny it. So if they chose to take no action, that would be treated like a denial, because what we have seen sometimes, I mean, you want to have some definition in there, and that is actually the 60 days is what we had in the previous one, and that worked pretty well. But so this is quite different from how we did it previously, when we had the 12 schools that finally opened, in that there would be 2 mechanisms, and I think this makes it frankly tighter. Now, if you read under B on line 140, we didn't have any of this language there before that you would demonstrate that you had special characteristics or, some feature or features that enhance educational opportunities. Because again, the goal is not to have charter schools that supplant local schools, but in fact offer something that is something different and something that would complement. Let me see what else here. Again, as with previously on line 159, the Commission shall take into consideration support or opposition by the local Board of Education or local boards of education. That was in it before. In this process and over the next few days, I want to flesh that out a little more to make absolutely sure that local boards of education have notice, that they have sufficient notice, and that if they truly, have concerns, we all would want the Commission to know about that. On line 162 through 164, this is new. Just put it in there actually last night. Previously, we required the Commission to offer training to the local governing councils. This requires that they participate in the training. There's another provision that I'm working on that you won't see here today, but based on input that I got from, frankly, some school boards right outside the metro area on the way to Macon, is that the Commission did develop rules and regs on making sure that there was appropriate notice to the potential student population. And so I don't want to define that too narrowly, because as technology changes, that may change, but I do absolutely want to make sure that there's something in here that expresses our intent and requirement that they would come up with rules and regs to make sure that the potential students are notified and have access to that information. The funding begins on section 20-2-2089. Rather than reading through all that, I will sort of sum it up for you. These students, as you calculate, or these schools, as you calculate lines 198 through 221, the effect of that would be that these students would be funded through a 20th program of QBE. So it would not fluctuate depending on where a student lives. If a student comes from the city of Decatur and another student comes from Pike County, the funding will be the same. The only difference would be on the characteristics that that student might have, like special needs or gifted. But they would earn through QBE and an average amount that would, but the sum would be the average of the lowest 3% of school systems as ranked through the equalization formula. So what that means is that that lowest 3% the funding was so low that when Representative England, Representative Coleman, I guess Dixon, Dudgeon, all those, when we did the equalization bill, that lowest 3% was thrown out of the formula because they were considered to be outliers and to be at such low funding. As an example, the lowest total funding in Georgia this year is Pike County. And that is the sum of equalization, 5 mil share, local revenue, local property taxes, state revenue, QBE. That number is $6,085. It would be the average of the lowest 4 or 5 systems that would, and we chose not to go. I initially started with the lowest, but you truly could have such an outlier that it seemed to be fair to take it to the lowest few, and it just happened to work out that it was precisely the ones that were not even included in that calculation in determining what was an adequate amount to distribute for equalization. I have, and then, let me see here. It clearly states again in the bill that no local money, of course we know no local money could ever be used because it's in the Constitution, but it repeats what would be in the constitutional amendment on line 227. No deduction shall be made to any state funding which a local school system is otherwise authorized to receive pursuant to this chapter as a direct result or consequence of the enrollment in a state charter school of a specific student or students who reside in the geographical area of the local school system. I'm also working, and we'll have this in the next day or so, I'm going to add some more language in keeping with what we passed, I don't remember if it was last year or the year before, on conflicts of interest for school boards. I want this language to be in there for governing councils, for the nonprofit that might manage this. Similar sorts of restrictions, and in fact I'm going further because there are two things that are very important to me and I think important to you. What I've heard is we want we don't want conflicts of interest, but furthermore we want Georgia teachers hired. We want Georgia businesses to be considered in contracts. Clearly, we don't want to dictate that when it makes sense to be otherwise. I'm certainly mindful that particularly around the edges of our state, we have our border states. We have good teachers who teach in our current regular school systems who live outside of Georgia, but I am tightening up some what I think were loopholes before in looking around the country to make sure that these will be, to the degree possible, we'll be hiring teachers that want jobs here in Georgia, and we will be utilizing through contracts for renovations and construction Georgia companies that have a substantial presence in Georgia. I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to take questions just for the meeting. And again, we're going to know where we're going. We're going to committee questions, members' orders. We'll have testimony at another time. Maybe we'll have a chance to look at it. 7 more minutes for everything today. We're just going to listen. Then when your questions are over, Representative Jones has a chance to summarize. We'll then adjourn and we'll have a chance to get with her at a later time. Then we'll have another full-blown hearing and announce time. Okay? Question. First question is number 34. Representative Ash.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Speaker Pro Tem, for a far improved 881. Let me just ask a couple strange little questions, okay, and then I'd love to have some conversation about the funding mechanism, okay, just because I have some things I need to understand. On line 20, state charter schools do not supplant public schools operated by local boards, but provide options to enhance. I'd feel a lot better if you'd put the word public in there one more time.
I'm sorry, on line 20?
It's line 21, to enhance public
sure,
educational
sure,
opportunities.
All right.
And then questions about dates. One is September 1st, 2012, and one, that's on page 4, and that's on page 2, and on page 3, there's an October 1st. Are we going to get this commission set up before the constitutional amendment is passed?
Yeah, that clearly needs to be changed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? All right. Number 20, Representative Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaker Pro Tem, one issue that was raised to me recently was wanting something in there to ensure that petitioners for a state charter school aren't allowed to, for lack of a better term, I'll use lobby commissioners about it. So I don't know if it's possible to have some kind of ex parte communications addressed in the bill. I mean, you know, obviously we'd want these things to be evaluated on their merits and not, you know, based on some explanation of it over dinner or golf or something like that.
Let's work on something like
Okay,
that.
thanks.
All right. All right. Any other questions? All right. I have here Representative. All right. All right. Representative Benton. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Pro Tem, we got just a couple of questions that and there's no particular section of the bill other than the fact that I was wondering why we see a need to have a charter commission while we can't just go through the State Board of Education. It would seem to me that at the State Board we have advocates for both areas, and we've just put another layer in there for that.
And I'm happy to continue that discussion. I've had that discussion in my head as well, and I'd like to get more input on it. I did want the State Board to have more of a hand over it, and that's why I dropped it down to a simple majority. They could turn down every single one if they wanted to. But I also felt that by having this I mean, you call it commission, committee, whatever, you know, that what works so well in talking to a couple State Board members as well is that they could sort of do the work and specialize in this, because the State Board has such broad responsibilities, looking a much larger picture than just this, that they could do the work for them. But I'm open to continue to have that discussion.
All right.
I see them truly as an arm of the State Board.
Okay. Got a couple more questions. Right. A couple more questions, Representative. These have to do with money, and it has to do with the funding. And I appreciate you getting in the amendment that the local monies would not be used. But I have a question about in these austere times, and we are looking to try to fund education, and we're not funding it where it ought to be. Why you feel like there needs to be another level of schools out there that would be pulling state dollars?
I mean, I don't know what else.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. I hear you, and I think there's a demand for parents to have. I mean, I think our responsibility as legislators is to offer whatever is needed and that we can supply in terms of enhancing the educational opportunities that students, and that's where I started. I started with the students. And I do believe that oftentimes that attendance lines and the way we're set up with local systems, sometimes, I guess I should say, that framework doesn't always work, and that the example being if you have a career academy that offers, you know, a technical school that has an area that it generally attracts students from across 7 or 8 counties, it is unlikely in the state that all the school boards could get together and transfer the funds, and that it would be more efficient to have a local authorizer. But what I also prefer is to, you know, make it an enhancement, not a duplication or to supplant what the local systems are offering.
Okay.
But and I did choose to go with a low level of funding, realizing that you know, I do think it will drive more charter petitions to have their preferred option more than before, the local school system. I'm just hopeful. It hasn't really happened in the past, but I'm hopeful that more school systems will be more open where possible. Sometimes they don't have sufficient density or sufficient students to do that, and I recognize that too.
One final question has to do with the running of charter schools, and it deals. And I saw this in the amendment, and I appreciate this being added that not-for-profits could petition for that. But I'm worried about, let's say you and I decide we want to petition for a charter school and we get one, but I'm not real good at running one, and so this for-profit group comes in and says, we'll run it for you. And I've got some concerns about that, because if they come in, we're running a good school, but they're not making a profit, then they're probably going to leave us in the lurch, students in the lurch. And I'm real concerned about there seems to be the thought that there's some money to be made out there, because I see people out there lobbying right now that are lobbying for this bill that have never lobbied for an education issue before in their life.
Well,
since I've been here.
I hear you, and there'll be less money to be made under this bill. But I think of 3 new cities in North Fulton. The city councils chose to hire a for-profit company called CH2M Hill to help them get off, to a good start, so that they could get it. But within 3 years, all 3 city councils had severed their ties, because they found that they didn't need a for-profit company. They could simply outsource. For example, what I would think of like a school, you might outsource your food services, or outsource, whatever they need to, that they could find if someone could do it more efficiently. But I don't want for-profit schools either, but I think that there will be, sort of like you might buy your textbooks from Amazon. That's a for-profit company. I couldn't just say you couldn't use any for-profit entity to supply. Textbooks come from for-profit companies, and your pencils come from for-profit. I think what concerns you is the degree, the magnitude of how far it goes.
If your example of books and pencils and stuff, that's kind of a set thing, and the state sets what books you can use and so forth. But
Right.
I'm concerned about these for-profit companies coming in, being here 4 or 5 years. They're not making any money, and all of a sudden they just leave, and you've got 1,000 students that the public school is still there, but we'll have to take those students back. I'm concerned about that.
Well, let's talk about
Okay.
what we could do to help address that. Yes.
Okay, I've got just a couple of quick questions, Representative Jones. Funding for virtual schools, we don't separate out anything, but the funding requirements for a virtual school should be substantially different for
Yeah,
most
and
others.
I'm not quite through with this. I want to take that into account. That I wouldn't want to set it at one level, because what we're seeing nationally, and not just with charter schools, but with traditional schools, is some are going more towards a hybrid, where students will go to a bricks and mortar, 3 days a week, or maybe even 5 days a week, but 2 days a week they're doing more online, and that's the good news about how we fund, is that it may be that we're going to get more and more efficiencies. But I do want to address that better as we move this forward.
One part of that in particular, it really doesn't make sense for virtual schools to be funded for school nurses.
School nurses are not in here.
Currently they are with some of our charter schools or virtual schools.
What I mean they're not funded is I did not include the state portion of school nurse funding in this calculation. I left it out.
Good.
I'm mindful that that is a tight pot of money, and so I did not include it.
One other concern for me is typically we talk about in funding situations that funding for anything is subject to appropriation, and we have a problem here if we have a commission school that's authorized by the commission, approved by the State Board of Education, and then suddenly we decide we don't have the funds to appropriate for that school. Sometimes it appears that we may be getting a decision ahead of the
everything that is subject to appropriation, including,
right,
as you know, traditional schools,
right,
and so everything, including this, would be subject to appropriation. And there's nothing that, you know, it's not going to be, it doesn't say in the constitutional amendment that you can't reduce their funding. It would be, but they would be similarly treated to other students, also realizing that they are going to be funded at a low level. But I mean, they would be just as subject to appropriations at your committee as would be the other areas.
Okay. I believe we have one more. Chairman Coleman had to go to another committee meeting, so Representative Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'll just start piggybacking on Representative Benton. So, and I guess Chairman Thomas, is it your intention to put something in here, I guess, to regulate the operations or of these EMOs and CMOs that are managing these charter schools? Or were you just talking about the lobbying effort that the chairman was talking about?
Well, I mean, he had his suggestion, but I am working on a section, and that's where I think this would fit in, is on conflicts of interest and making sure that we don't have dual roles on, you know, someone's not on a governing council, but also serving on a vendor, similar to how we do with school boards now. I think it is vitally important that we have some language in there that we put in, and so I'll have that the next time.
Would you be willing to look at anything that looks at the management fees that the charter schools are paying? I'm looking at the report that the Department of Education put out, and I just pulled out the schools in Atlanta, and the management fees vary. The highest one I saw of any school, Atlanta Heights Charter, has been in existence 1 year, $4.7 million management fee. Right. I've seen them go from 0 to $4.7 million for 364 students. That
yeah, I mean, I really hadn't thought, but I mean, I would like specific suggestions, and I mean, it's sort of similar to, I mean, just to be blunt, it's sort of like what we did with the 65% rule for school systems. We said we don't want it to all, you know, we want more of, it's the same concept, whether you like the definition. I realize many don't like the definition of the 65% rule, but it was the same sort of thought. We want the money in the classroom educating students. Similar, I think it's a similar analogy, thought.
I had one more question.
Okay.
We've just gotten this substitute to 797. We're still trying to look through it. I wanted to ask a question about 1162.
Okay.
Since 1162 is the amendment in the vote, I want to know if you might be willing to postpone the vote on that tomorrow until we get a completed 797.
I'd rather go ahead and get a vote, and we could, if the committee, I mean, we can even wait a year. To be honest, I had originally planned to wait until next year to see if the legislature even had an appetite, because if you remember, what we're reacting to is not just a constitutional amendment and new enabling. We're reacting to a decision from May 11, and we have 12 charter schools that are now operating, I think, with very tenuous authority from us, and I wanted to let you see the direction of where we're going on the funding, the framework, and everything. But I would prefer to go ahead and have a vote.
Do you understand why I'm asking that?
Right.
If we vote on 1162 tomorrow and it passes, then this here could.
Right. The same thing's true, though, when it gets over to the Senate. I mean, it was kind of like,
We've had your word on other things that said if it leaves the House in this form, I won't go along with what gets changed, and I would kind of want something like that from you as well.
Yep.
You know, all of us are taking a beating right now from local school systems and local parents that are not for the charter schools. So,
well, it is possible that this, I mean, I don't know how likely it is, it's possible that we could pass a constitutional amendment and that this committee could produce a bill that we or the Senate does not like, or that, you know, we just couldn't come to an agreement, and we would come back after the people vote. I guess I don't see them linked as much together as maybe you do, but I think it is important that we work on this and hopefully come to an agreement this year so that everybody knows what we're doing.
I think it's a whole lot easier to get 91 votes than it is 120 votes.
That may be.
Okay. Thank you.
Now I have a question from Representative Axe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm concerned about those 12 schools. I understand there's some money in appropriations for continuing their funding. Is that going to solve their problem while we wait to pass
Yes.
a constitutional amendment? And then is it envisioned that they would have to go back through the process? What's the sort of time?
There's language in here similar to what we did before. We had some, the state's been authorizing, this is nothing new.
Right.
The state's been authorizing charter schools for 10 years. The first one was in Statesboro, CCAP. And
only with
so
state
there's language in here to allow them to then, if the state board agrees, correct me if I'm wrong, Betsy, do you know what line that is?
Yes, on page 6 on line 170.
Okay.
171.
So if the state board agrees to it, they can then apply to the commission. Now, what I will say, there was a state-authorized school, authorized by the board, 2 of them actually, that were never approved by the commission. And the commission received over 130 applications. They only processed 76 in that range because they told the others, I mean, you're not even in the realm of, anywhere in the realm of possibility. And of those, 15 were approved and 12 opened. So, the process worked pretty well to keep it very narrow. I think this will narrow it up even more. You have to demonstrate more things that were not envisioned 4 years ago. But so to answer your question, they, if they were approved, they would be accommodated. If the state board agreed to it, and if the commission, which is appointed by and can be overturned by the state board if the commission agreed.
And in the meantime, how are the allocations we're proposing to put in this year's budget going to be appropriated between those 12 schools?
I'm going to have to be honest. You'll have to ask the chairman of Appropriations Education up here. I haven't really, that'll be going through the education or through the appropriations process now, but the governor did put money in there. It is certainly his intent that these schools be funded until we can come to a long-term resolution here.
I guess I better ask that question in another arena. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any further questions? Would you like to sum up? Or do you have some final comments?
I don't, we're day 21 today, so certainly need to get this done, over the next 9 legislative days. Certainly would prefer not to take it to day 30, but I hope you'll work with me if you have specific suggestions, and I'm hopeful that we can come up with a good overall framework.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That being the only item on the agenda, this committee will be adjourned.